What unfolds when a 72-year-old black farmer faces arrest on his own property? No warrant, no crime, no voice. This narrative transcends mere fields and handcuffs. It delves into the deep-seated roots of racism embedded in America's very soil. And the determined battle waged by one granddaughter to unearth them might just reshape everything. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is more than a tale. It's a potent testament to the quiet might and persistent pursuit of justice in places often overlooked. If you're new here, I warmly invite you to share your viewing location in the comments below. And if stories like this resonate with you, challenge your perspective, or spark contemplation, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon. We champion voices that deserve to be heard every single day. Thank you for being present. Now let's immerse ourselves in the narrative. The morning sun cast a golden glow across the vast fields of Tula, Georgia, a tranquil town where stillness didn't always equate to peace. The corn whispered in the breeze, seemingly oblivious to the impending disruption, the sirens yet to pierce the quiet, the dust soon to rise on the gravel path, the sound of boots on parched earth that had known both toil and sorrow. Eli Mercer, a 72-year-old black farmer, stood in his boots, as worn and weathered as the hands that had cultivated his land for decades. His back ached, yet he moved with grace, methodically planting row after row of sweet corn. This land had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was more than just soil. It was history, heritage, and a declaration of dignity in a world too often forgetful of the cost of brown hands producing white prosperity. Initially, he didn't detect the engines, only the sudden hush of birds taking flight. Then came the crunch of tires, the crackle of radios, and abrupt commands. By the time Eli turned towards the commotion, police officers were already stepping through his gate. Not the familiar local sheriffs, not faces from church or the general store. These were state agents, armored, unsmiling, their gazes focused and vacant. Hands where we can see them. Eli slowly raised them. His voice was calm. This is my land. They neither listened nor inquired. A young officer, burdened by excessive fear and lacking wisdom, stepped forward, clamped handcuffs on Eli's wrists, and propelled him towards the patrol car. The cornfield watched in silence. So did the neighbor's dog. So did the white woman across the fence line, who retreated behind her porch screen as if she saw nothing. The accusation was vague. Suspicion of involvement in agricultural theft, though nothing had been reported missing. There were no victims, only assumptions. And Eli, with his calloused hands and dignified silence, had become an effortless target. What intensified the injustice was the murmur, the kind that sweeps through small southern towns faster than morning mist. He must have done something, they whispered. The police wouldn't just show up like that. Yet deep down, even those who repeated it knew it wasn't true. Eli had never missed church, never uttered a harsh word publicly. He grew food and paid his taxes. His sole transgression was being a black man on fertile land. At the police station, his mugshot was taken. The camera's flash illuminated the deep lines on his face, etched not by age, but by generations of witnessing justice warp around people like him. The sergeant appeared unsettled, glancing at the arrest sheet, then at Eli. "Are you sure you have the right person?" he muttered to the arresting officer. But the officer merely shrugged. "We received a tip. Besides, the system will resolve it." Eli remained silent. He didn't need to speak. He had lived long enough to understand that silence can, at times, be the most potent form of protest. News of the arrest spread. Some neighbors offered cautious sympathy. "It's a mistake. He's a good man." Others remained quiet, unwilling to challenge the authority wearing badges and carrying firearms. But one voice refused to be silenced. Maya, Eli's 28-year-old granddaughter, a civil rights lawyer from Atlanta, who had spent her childhood running barefoot through Eli's cornrows, absorbing tales of resilience and spirit. When she received the call, Maya didn't weep. She packed her bag, drove 3 hours without pause, and arrived at the station with a briefcase brimming with legal knowledge and righteous indignation. "I demand to see the arrest warrant," she asserted, her voice sharp as thunder. The officer hesitated, even flinched, but handed it over. It was flimsy. No substantive evidence, no victim, just a report filed by an anonymous caller, later identified as the same woman who had once attempted to purchase Eli's land and was politely informed it wasn't for sale. Maya's eyes narrowed. She recognized the game. She had studied it in law school textbooks and observed it in courtrooms. But now it had landed on her grandfather's doorstep. That evening Maya sat beside Eli in his holding cell. He seemed weary but not defeated. "Granddad," she whispered, "I'm getting you out." Eli offered a faint smile. "Don't rush. Let them feel the weight of it. Let them write the report, fill in the blanks and realize they have nothing. I have time. What I don't have is fear." Outside, stars shimmered in the Georgia sky. Yet beneath that quiet sparkle, a story was beginning to unfold, one that would expose more than a wrongful arrest. It would excavate old roots, illuminate decaying systems, and remind everyone watching that dignity once imperiled does not simply vanish into the night. And in the silence of a jail cell where an old man refused to be humiliated, a movement began to stir. By sunrise the next day, Tula's police station was anything but quiet. What had begun as whispers over diner counters and murmurs in church pews had erupted into open dialogue. Some murmured in shame, others shouted in outrage. Maya stood before her grandfather's porch, her phone illuminated with calls from journalists, civil rights attorneys, and even a few city council members who had never before stepped foot on Eli Mercer's land. The cornfields behind her swayed gently in the wind, tall and defiant, much like Eli himself. Eli had spoken little since his release, but his silence was not one of defeat. It was the quiet of a man choosing his moment, gathering strength like water behind a dam. He had witnessed this before in different guises with different uniforms. His father had been dragged from this very land in 1963 during a fabricated dispute over voting rights. Eli, then a boy, had hidden behind a barrel of seed potatoes, watching white officers mock his father's accent and shackle his hands as if he were mere livestock. But even then young Eli learned a vital truth. Land remembers, and so do the people who cultivate it. Maya stood beside him that morning, a stack of documents in her hands and fire in her heart. "Grandpa, I'm going to file a civil rights violation case against Hole, the department and the county." Eli nodded once, but his gaze remained fixed on the field. "Do it not just for me, baby," he said, his voice low. "Do it for every brown-skinned hand that planted something in this soil and was scorned for daring to dream it would flourish." Word spread quickly. That afternoon, an unexpected figure appeared at the farm. Reverend Josiah Carter, now nearing 80, yet still walking with the same dignified gait that had led marches in Selma. He embraced Eli without words. They hadn't spoken in years, but history doesn't fade. It merely lies dormant until summoned. Reverend Carter stood before a growing crowd at the edge of Eli's property that evening, Bible in hand, but his voice rooted not solely in scripture but in memory. This land is woven with the sweat of black men and women who dared to claim it as their own. What happened to Brother Eli isn't just a mistake, it's a pattern. One they thought we'd stop noticing if they wore suits instead of hoods. Maya organized a community meeting on the very soil where Eli had been arrested. Neighbors arrived. Teachers, farmers, retired postal workers, teenagers who had only heard stories of racism in textbooks and believed it a relic of a bygone era. One by one, people shared their experiences. A Latina woman named Rosa spoke of being denied a loan despite perfect credit. A black high school senior described being followed in the pharmacy every time he wore his hoodie. This was not solely Eli's story, it was theirs too. Then Eli stood. He appeared smaller than he once was, but when he spoke, his voice resonated louder than the field behind him. "They didn't come for me because I broke a law. They came for me because I shattered their illusion that a black man in his 60s couldn't own land this rich. They don't arrest us because we're criminals. They arrest us because we're proof they're wrong." A long silence followed, not born of discomfort but of reverence. Maya reached out to the state NAACP, and within 48 hours their spokesperson arrived, offering legal assistance and demanding a federal review of the Tula Sheriff's Department. Suddenly the incident was no longer local, it was national. Headlines shifted from "elderly man mistakenly detained" to "systemic racism in Tula, one farmer's stand." But not everyone welcomed the scrutiny. Someone painted a red X on Eli's barn. A tire was slashed. A neighbor who once offered eggs every Sunday now crossed the street rather than wave. Still Eli held his ground. Literally. He spent every morning walking the rows of his cornfields as he always had. "Fear doesn't nourish a crop," he told Maya. "Discipline does." and faith. When Officer Holt was placed on administrative leave, the town fractured. Some called it justice, others an overreaction. But the truth was simpler than either side would admit. A man had been humiliated for the crime of being black and dignified in a place where only one of those traits was acceptable. A local reporter interviewed Maya on the front porch. "What do you hope to achieve?" he inquired. He didn't hesitate. "Not vengeance but visibility. Not just for my grandfather but for every person who's been quietly dismissed, disrespected, discarded." She paused. "We don't want a parade. We want policy. We want accountability." The roots of resistance were no longer buried. They had broken through, reaching skyward like stalks of corn defying drought. And in that soil, heavy with injustice and history, something else was beginning to blossom. Not rage but resolve. That night, as Maya and Eli sat on the porch watching fireflies flicker in the dark, he uttered words she would carry for a lifetime. "They thought they buried me," he whispered. "But they forgot I was a seed. And this time the harvest would be justice." The courthouse in Monroe, just an hour east of Tula, had never witnessed such a multitude gathered outside its steps. Not for a celebrity trial or a political scandal, but for a 67-year-old black farmer with hands weathered by labor and stories as profound as riverbeds. Eli Mercer wore no grand attire, simply his Sunday denim jacket and clean boots. But that morning as he entered the courtroom flanked by Maya and Reverend Carter, his presence transformed those polished marble floors into hallowed ground. The hearing was not a criminal trial, not yet. It was a procedural review initiated by the Louisiana State Civil Rights Commission to determine if probable cause existed for a formal civil suit. Yet everyone in that room understood it concerned something far grander than mere procedure. It was about establishing a precedent. Maya had meticulously compiled evidence. Surveillance footage showing officers entering Eli's home without a warrant, body camera audio in which Officer Hole muttered, "Should have known this place was too nice for his kind," and statements from neighbors who, despite fear of reprisal, had come forward to attest they had never known Eli to be involved in anything criminal. One even testified he saw Eli in the fields at the exact time Hole's report claimed he was acting suspiciously near a local store. The defense argued reasonable suspicion, citing an anonymous tip that never materialized into a verifiable source. But it wasn't merely the fragility of their case that resonated. It was their detached, technical, unmoved tone. Eli, when called to the stand, did not speak with the fiery cadence of a victim demanding justice. His voice was measured, almost hushed, as if the words he carried had aged like oak barrels, made stronger by the time they'd spent unuttered. "I didn't come here to ruin a man's career," he stated plainly. "I came here because I've lived through 3 generations of this same story, and I don't want my granddaughter to live through a 4th. Not a sound was heard in the courtroom. Even the judge's gavel paused mid-air. Reverend Carter later remarked it reminded him of Dr. King's final sermon. Solemn, steady, steeped in pain, yet profoundly purposeful. Outside the courthouse, media vans hummed and protesters waved signs bearing Eli's face and slogans like, "Farmer not felon," and "Soil has memory." Maya addressed the cameras with a composure that belied her youth. "My grandfather was not arrested because of who he is. He was arrested because of what his skin represents to a system still tainted by its own past." Her words echoed far beyond the Louisiana border. CNN covered the story as did the Washington Post. Hashtags like #Justice for Eli, #Not on our soil, and #Badge and bias trended. But while the country rallied, local pressure intensified. Maya received veiled threats in her mailbox. Eli's tractor was found vandalized one morning, its tires slashed and the words "Stay in your row" spray painted across the barn. The sheriff's department launched an internal review but offered no genuine accountability. Officer Hole remained on administrative leave, still receiving a paycheck. So Eli did not waver. "If I concede now," he told Maya, "I let them win twice. First for arresting me, then for silencing me through fear." What followed was an unexpected surge of solidarity. Black farmers from across the South drove in to help him replant the ruined rows. Volunteers from civil rights organizations mended his barn and assisted in repairing his tractor. Local teachers began incorporating Eli's story into their civics classes to illustrate modern-day racism within institutions we often perceive as just. The case was no longer a question of whether Eli had been wronged. that was undeniable. The question was what would be done about it. At a community town hall, a younger white woman named Elise Harrington, born and raised in Tula, stood up with trembling hands. I used to believe this town was past all that. But now I see the roots run deeper, and if we're not the ones to pull them up, they'll keep strangling anything that tries to grow. Her words were met with applause but also glares, because truth in a small town is dangerous when it disrupts comfort. Weeks later, the Civil Rights Commission released its findings. A formal lawsuit would be filed against the Tula Sheriff's Department for unlawful detainment, racial profiling, and violation of constitutional rights. The Department of Justice announced it would commence its own investigation. The night of the announcement, Maya sat beside Eli on the porch once more. The fields were beginning to turn golden under the summer sun, resilient in a way that mirrored their owner. "Do you think it will change anything?" she asked. Eli didn't answer immediately. He watched the wind ripple through the stalks like a congregation swaying in prayer. "Not everything," he finally said, "but maybe enough to give the next boy with hands like mine a different kind of morning." The harvest wasn't just crops that season. It was truth, hard-earned, painstakingly sown, and long overdue. And though the path ahead was still marred by potholes of injustice, something undeniable had shifted. For the first time in a long time, the soil of Tula bore not just the weight of history but the seeds of change. The summer sun had begun its gradual descent over the horizon, casting a golden hue across the cornfields of Tula. The stalks swayed gently in the evening breeze, whispering narratives only the land could recall. Among them stood Eli Mercer, weathered yet unbroken, his silhouette framed against the light like a monument sculpted by time. Months had elapsed since the courtroom hearing, yet the resonance of what had been ignited still hung in the air, electric like the moments before a storm. Eli never sought to be a symbol. All he ever desired was peace, a bountiful harvest, a welcoming porch, and the sound of his granddaughter's laughter echoing through the fields. But life doesn't always ask us who we wish to be. Sometimes it makes the choice for us. And when injustice knocked on his door that spring morning, Eli responded not with fury, but with the quiet defiance of a man whose roots ran deeper than hatred. In the aftermath of the trial, change began to permeate Tula like light through fractured shutters. The sheriff, who had once overlooked Officer Holt's behavioral patterns, resigned under mounting pressure. Holt himself faced disciplinary hearings, not just for Eli's unlawful arrest, but for a history of misconduct finally brought to public awareness. The town was no longer silent. Reverend Carter's church saw its attendance double, transforming into a hub for dialogue, healing, and voter registration drives. But it wasn't solely institutions that shifted the needle. It was the people. Neighbors who had once maintained their distance now crossed fences to say, "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." School teachers incorporated Eli's story into their lesson plans. Farm supply companies offered donations to support Black-owned agricultural endeavors. And young activists, inspired by Maya's unyielding voice, organized across the county to demand policy reform. Still, amidst all the commotion, Eli remained Eli. He rose before dawn, fed the chickens, tended to the corn, and sat on the same porch with the same thermos of black coffee. Fame did not alter him. If anything, it sharpened his sense of purpose. His story had traveled widely, New York Times articles, CNN segments, even a featured documentary, yet he never watched a single one. "If the truth requires my face, let it be used," he told Maya. "But my work is out there in the soil." Maya, now in her final year of college, had matured into a leader in her own right. She declined summer internships in Washington to remain in Tula and assist her grandfather in establishing something he had only previously whispered about, a foundation to support young Black farmers. They named it Roots Unbroken, and its mission was unambiguous: to equip, educate, and empower the next generation of agricultural leaders, often disregarded by the system. Through this foundation, Eli began mentoring local youth. Teenagers once headed for trouble discovered purpose in planting rows of okra or learning crop rotation techniques. He taught them not merely how to farm, but how to carry themselves with dignity in a world too quick to dismiss them. "You've got to treat this land like you treat yourself," he would say, "with patience, with care, and with pride." One afternoon, while demonstrating to a 14-year-old how to repair a broken irrigation pipe, Eli paused, gazing at the horizon. "You see that line between the field and the sky?" he asked. The boy nodded. That line's not truly there. It just appears so from here. That's how most barriers in this life function. They're only real if you don't move towards them. In that simple analogy, Eli distilled what generations of textbooks failed to convey: perspective, resilience, and quiet revolution. As autumn arrived, the town gathered for the first annual Tula Community Harvest Festival. It had been Maya's idea, but the townsfolk had embraced it as a celebration of unity. Vendors lined the square. Music played from the church steps. And at the heart of it all was Eli, his photograph displayed beside a plaque that read, "A man who cultivated more than crops. He cultivated change." Eli spoke little at the event, but when Reverend Carter invited him to share a few words, he took the microphone and surveyed the crowd: black, white, young, old. Neighbors who had once avoided his gaze now applauding him with pride. "I didn't set out to change anything," he said. "But when the world pressed down, I just stood where I was planted. And sometimes that's enough to make a forest grow." The applause thundered, not for his eloquence but for his truth. Weeks later, Eli passed peacefully in his sleep beneath a quilt his late wife had sewn decades earlier. His obituary did not list degrees or titles. It simply read, "Eli Mercer, farmer, father, fighter, friend." His funeral drew hundreds. People traveled from as far as Atlanta and Houston. Tributes poured in from activists, senators, farmhands, and mayors alike. But the most touching eulogy came from Maya. "My grandfather never raised his voice," she said, her voice trembling yet resolute. "But the world heard him anyway." Eli's ashes were scattered over the land he cherished, between rows of corn that stood taller than ever, nourished not just by soil but by story. And in every stalk, every furrow, every breeze through the fields lived the legacy of a man who demonstrated that resistance doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears overalls and holds a hoe. The farmer was gone, but what he planted would continue to grow. Season after season, voice after voice, justice after justice. And that was the true harvest, the one that would never end. Eli Mercer's story is not merely a chronicle of one man wrongfully arrested in his cornfield. It's an account of quiet strength rooted in dignity, watered by decades of injustice endured with unwavering resolve. From the moment the handcuffs clasped his weathered wrists, the world around him began to unravel and then unexpectedly to awaken. For decades, Eli led a simple life in the heart of Tula, a farmer who sought nothing but peace and a good harvest. Yet his black skin became an unspoken target in a town still burdened by the specters of systemic racism. When police arrived under false pretenses with badges gleaming brighter than their intentions, they didn't just detain a man, they ignited a movement. What ensued was not rage but resistance. Not fire but roots. Eli did not retaliate with lawsuits or headlines. He simply stood calmly, truth on his side. It was his granddaughter, Maya, who turned the tide of change. Young, fierce, and resolute, she gave voice to what her grandfather endured in silence. And together, across generations, they challenged a system that had too long mistaken silence for submission. Their story unveiled both the best and worst of Tula. It revealed neighbors who had turned a blind eye for too long, but also inspired them to rise up. It unmasked corrupt officers, but also propelled community leaders into action. From church pews to courtroom benches, from local schoolhouses to national headlines, Eli's name became a symbol not of victimhood, but of quiet revolution. But Eli never sought fame. While the world discussed him, he returned to his fields. He mentored the youth. He founded Roots Unbroken not to punish the past but to prepare the future. In teaching teenagers how to cultivate crops, he taught them how to cultivate character. Every seed he planted carried a profound message. You do not need to shout to be heard. And you do not need to fight to change everything. Sometimes simply standing firm where you are is enough. When he passed away, it was not with bitterness but with purpose fulfilled. The man who had been dragged from his land had reclaimed it, not with force but with legacy. His granddaughter now carries his torch. His foundation continues to flourish. And Tula, once blind, now perceives just a little more clearly because of him. So what can we glean from Eli Mercer? We learn that racism isn't always overt. It's often systemic, masked, and routine, delivered in silence. But we also learn that dignity is more potent than any prejudice. That wisdom doesn't scream, it whispers in the wind between corn rows. That true revolution doesn't always commence in courts or Congress. but in the hearts of those who refuse to be broken. In today's world where division proliferates faster than unity, and truth is often drowned out by noise, Eli's story reminds us that change begins quietly. In how we treat our neighbors, in what we tolerate in silence, in whom we choose to stand beside when injustice arrives. And most importantly, we are all responsible. Whether we are Maya, speaking truth to power, or Eli, standing grounded with grace, each of us has the opportunity to plant something better than what we've inherited. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, feel, or even pause, then don't let it conclude here. Share it. Reflect on it. Discuss it with someone. Let Eli's legacy grow in your life too. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, real stories that break the silence, uplift the unheard, and illuminate long-standing darkness, then hit that subscribe button. Your support fuels this journey, and your voice helps amplify others like Eli who may never speak for themselves, because sometimes the smallest seed can grow into the strongest tree. And every voice, just like every harvest, begins with one person who dares to simply be.